Okay, so now to our main event. I don't think I have to say very much about Marianne Hirsch because I'm pretty sure that all of you know her, and I know that a lot of you are using her work when you're writing your own articles and books and publications. But I wanted to quickly introduce her. So Marianne Hirsch is the William Petterfield Trent Professor of English and Comparative Literature. She's working at Columbia University in New York. And she's also professor in the Institute for Research on Women, Gender and Sexuality. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she's a former president of the Modern Language Association of America, MLA. I know a lot of people sometimes write us emails saying, oh, yeah, I'm interested in the MLA, and I'm like, no, it's MSA. She's also currently the director of the Columbia Center for the Study of Social Difference. Now, Hirsch's work combines feminist theory with memory studies, and particularly the transmission of memories of violence across generations. Her recent books include the generation of post-memory. Post-memory is one of the terms that probably you're very much familiar with. It's constantly being used by other memory scholars, so she's really coined a concept here. And this book appeared in Columbia University Press in 2012. Then we have Ghosts of Home, The Afterlife of Chernowitz in Jewish Memory, which was co-authored with Leo Spitzer. That was the University of California Press in 2010. You have Rites of Return, Diaspora, Poetics and the Politics of Memory, which was co-edited with Nancy Miller, again Columbia University Press 2011. And then other publications, I'm not going to mention them all, just a few ones that you might be familiar with. One is Family Frames, Photography, Narrative and Post-Memory, The Familiar Gaze of 1999, Time and the Literary in 2002, Teaching the Representation of the Holocaust in 2004, and Grace Paley Writing the World in 2009. To tell you a little bit about what she's working out at the moment, she's currently at work on a co-authored book and an exhibition with Leo Spitzer entitled School Photos in Liquid Time, Archives of Possibility. She's also working on a book on memory studies and practices, which is entitled Memory for the Future, Body, Sites, Archives, Action. And she's also co-editing a book on women mobilizing memory. I don't know how you do all these things all at the same time. Anyway, let's welcome Marianne Hirsch. We are very glad that you're here.
Can you hear me? I'm not used to this TED Talk mode of speaking, so I'll have to get used to it. Since we're all here together, and it's one of the rare occasions that we are during this wonderful conference, I was wondering if you would get up and join me in thanking our co-presidents and our organizers of this conference. Thanks. It's really, I'm very grateful and humbled by the invitation. I just realized how nervous I am to speak about my work in this room because this is the audience that I've learned so much from, and almost anything I will say, at least one of you will have written a book about. So I think we're kind of creating a field together over the last couple of decades, and into the future if the attendance at this meeting and the membership in this association is any indication of what we're doing together. And it's very much in the making, and so I'd like to offer some of my work in progress and this idea of stateless memory, which is very much a wager, and I will appreciate your feedback as it's pretty much work in progress. Stateless. I want to start with an epigram by Wangechi Mutu, who's one of the artists I'll be talking about. Something about the past reminds us of what the future might look like. Something for us to think about in terms of the kind of temporality that we talk about and try to define in memory studies. Stateless. This word brings back a cluster of bodily reactions and emotions I have trouble untangling. especially when I say it in German, Stateless. Can everybody hear me? Yes. As I utter or write it, my palms sweat. I feel a lump in my throat. My breath is short. My heart beats faster. My head bends down, my shoulders slump. I feel shame and fear. I feel things I don't know how to name. I was staatenlos, stateless as a child. At age 11, I left communist Romania with my parents. Upon our immigration, our citizenship was revoked, the state ID card replaced by a little booklet with our pictures, a travel permit. On the paper, our nationality was marked as stateless. We had train tickets to Austria, but our transit visas were valid for just one day. Our entry visas were to Israel. The train trip through Romania and Hungary and across the Iron Curtain was punctuated by officials in different uniforms, checking the travel permits, interrogating my parents, examining our luggage. You could not take any valuables out of the country, so my thin gold chain with a little red heart was removed from my neck at the Romanian border. The border guards cut open the stomach of my teddy bear to see if anything was hidden inside. Straw came out, and the hole kept getting wider through the trip. My own stomach churned with fear. I had imagined the Iron Curtain to be a physical barrier, but it was only guards with different uniforms appearing in the middle of the night, ominously recalling the Second World War that I had heard so much about. They made sure to remind us that we had to leave Austria the next day, and as they left, we knew we were on the other side, free. At the Westbahnhof, Vienna's main train station, we were met by a representative of the agency in charge of us. He insisted on taking us, along with a larger group of immigrants, to a transit camp for the night so that we could board a plane to Israel the next morning. During the Cold War and Israel's effort to attract Jewish immigrants, such agencies worked hard to make the transition as smooth as possible. But my parents had decided to stay in Austria while exploring where in the world they might eventually be able to obtain visas and citizenship. And that's how the lies began. My father promised we'd be at the airport the next morning. We were going to spend the night with cousins, recent immigrants themselves. But we never went to the airport. We now had neither money, nor valuables, nor papers, nor was anybody responsible for our survival. We were free, but the term staatenlos, stateless, came to encompass this sense of dispossession and negation, this loss of identity. It connotes the hiding and lying, the fear of discovery, the feeling when we finally did obtain a temporary residency permit in Austria of being tolerated but unwanted, of being other. And it brings back the appeals for asylum and the yearning for the legitimation of citizenship and a passport, for a sense of home. And yet, at the very same time, stateless also evokes a sense of release, a giddy liberation that the sheer ability to cross an ironclad border brought with it. It connotes the sense of possibility that unbelonging can engender. And for me, it has these contradictory associations to this day, over a half-century later. Well into their 90s, my parents prized every document they possessed and showed great fear of officials asking for them. I kind of fall into this behavior as well. And every time I open my US passport at an immigration booth, my body relaxes, and I'm so grateful to have a valid one. Being able to cross a border without fear is not something I'll ever take for granted. But once I do, I still imagine not knowing where I will go next. I can be here and I can be somewhere else. I can be from somewhere else. I can be someone else. As I was preparing this talk, a number of stateless people across Europe, many of them like me trying to cross Hungary into Austria, are multiplying. Their fates uncertain, their homes destroyed. The same is true in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, in Central America, in Mexico, and the US, across Africa. In the United States, Donald Trump is still planning on building a wall to keep immigrants and refugees out. It is estimated that 11 million people currently living in the US are stateless, or in today's terms, undocumented, unauthorized, illegal. This fall, Trump decided unilaterally to end the small DACA program that protected about 800,000 of them, people who came to the United States illegally as young children under the age of 16 and who have lived there continuously since. The DACA program protected them from deportation. Despite its attractive association with the American dream of hospitality for the vulnerable from across the globe, the controversial DREAM Act that was signed into law by President Obama in 2012 to create this program has an unfortunate name, DREAM, Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors, the DREAM Act. I don't think people actually know what DREAM stands for. It required an A, and the A is for alien. To be alien is to be other, strange, unwanted, stateless. I was fortunate to immigrate to the US legally with my parents, who had managed with great effort and after a long wait to obtain visas and the generous support of the HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and the Jewish Family Service of Providence, Rhode Island, who helped us relocate. Volunteers welcomed us and brought us into the apartment they had prepared for us in Providence. I was 12. All was utterly unfamiliar in English, a language I did not speak, but it was our new home. Though now legal, we continued to be stateless until we got our green cards. With green cards, you still don't get a passport, but you can travel internationally. 5 years later, my parents and I could apply for citizenship. With my naturalization certificate, which is what citizenship papers are called, I became American. To be stateless, it seems, is to be unnatural. And yet some attributes of statelessness stick to me still and engender some of today's reflections. Despite these negative associations with loss and negation, I'd like to venture this morning that aspects of statelessness could be claimed as ways of opening a space of possibility rather than merely constituting a blockage to be overcome. And I include among these stateless memory. If I do so, it's not simply to add another term to the many terms that we've coined in memory studies, our current conceptions of cultural memory as transnational, transcultural, cosmopolitan, multidirectional, connective, borderless, global, or globital. And it's not simply to add another term to definitions of mnemonic circulation, travels, and itineraries. These useful terms have fruitfully challenged the idea that memory is bounded by a culture or nation state, either serving or contesting hegemonic national and ethnic identities. The work on transnational memory, theorized by many people in this room, and so richly represented at this conference, contests public memory cultures and practices and institutions that, it seems to me, reanimate and support nationalist imaginaries in many places around the globe. And I'm thinking of the numerous new museums and memory rituals that reify hegemonic versions of the past and are used to celebrate its mythologies, to solidify its boundaries, and to consolidate its power, thus keeping others out. In what we've been thinking about as its transnational term, the academic study of memory is reactivating instead the critical counter-hegemonic power and potential that defined the field in the 1990s and continues to do so in this day in acts of contestation. And I would venture that it is this critical potential that brought many of us, maybe most of us in this room, to the field in the first place, and that continue to provoke and to inspire the critique of nationalism within national frames. But today I'd like to step out of those national frames to think about other modes of critique. The idea of stateless memory emerges for me from the reflections on refugee or migrant memory, also represented at this conference in so many of its panels. As Anne Rigney and Chiara de Cesare point out, these are people and experiences that are often left out not just of national, but also of transnational memory culture. What is more, unlike transnational or comparative analyses of memory practices in different national and cultural contexts, and of the entanglement of those contexts with one another, migrant, diasporic, refugee, or stateless memory sheds light on the intimate qualities, on the affects and textures of memorial acts of transfer in conditions of forced displacement. They highlight the effects of displacement on subjects and communities who carry memory as both burden and possibility, and on the post-memorial transmission of these effects into the future. In distinguishing stateless memory from other forms of diasporic recollection, however, I want to specify the particular affects and experiences of the in-between condition of statelessness that I tried to evoke for you in this very personal way. In addition to exploring how memory travels across borders, this is an effort to articulate statelessness as a pause or suspension in the very performance of mobility, whether chosen or imposed. The hiatus that is statelessness contains, it seems to me, multiple temporalities, spaces, and conceptions of identity and community, as well as multiple possibilities of encounter and transformation. It's not static, but dynamic. It's not passive, but active. But its activity is not uni, but multi-directional, to coin a phrase. This suspension in time and space, however protracted by circumstance, can suggest ways of mobilizing memory of painful pasts in a different time frame than the progression toward preordained futures that often seem inevitable in the space-time of the nation-state and the catastrophes it causes and suffers and that it recalls as part of its identity. But can stateless memories provide a platform for imagining different potential relationships between contemporary subjects and citizenship, national belonging and home, as well as alternate temporalities of becoming? This is what I'd like to try to accomplish in this talk. This is the question I'm posing myself for this morning, and I hope you'll help me answer it. To define stateless memory and to convey some of its visceral particularities, I'd like to turn, as I often do, to artistic works that practice what I'd like to think of as a stateless aesthetic. The works I'd like to discuss with you this morning acknowledge the vulnerabilities of statelessness, the violence of forced migration, and the difficulties of exile, even as they mobilize the fluid creative power of a stateless imagination as an alternative to fixed and static, recuperative nationalist and ethnocentric imaginaries. They mobilize the stateless as a form of opposition and resistance, activating small, unofficial, non-hegemonic archives and behaviors, as well as alternative circuits of connectivity and encounter, of subject and community formation, of space and time. I'd like to think that they remember forward, this is Carol Gluck's term from yesterday that I find so resonant, for a future yet to be invented, but as you will see, their work is neither optimistic nor in any way redemptive. So I'd like to begin with the work of Mirta Kupfermink, a Jewish Argentinian artist. And this is a work from 2001, a black and white etching and Camino on the way. And I think this work that I've actually turned to before offers a performance of what I'm thinking about as stateless memory. And Camino illustrates the difficult conditions of mobility in the aftermath of persecution and expulsion, and it exhibits both the dangers and potentialities inherent in diasporic stateless memory acts. Here we have 7 figures attempting to move from left to right, but they're immobilized, they're pulled backward, they're hunched over under the weight of the objects they carry. And they carry not just uprooted trees, but houses, household objects, windmills, entire villages. This is even more dramatic in the vertical triptych version, in which the trees cover the top 2 panels, dwarfing the human figures under their shadow. And what's more, these figures seem to float on different planes. There's no solid ground under their feet. Though the momentum points forward, they're slowed by the weight of memory in the past, a burden they cannot seem to shed. They lack the material support that might enable a freely chosen mobility. They're victims of expulsion. Their refugees were stalled, immobilized by the burdens they carry. The cultural geographer Karen Till has observed that places become part of us. When humans emigrate, interact, and engage with others through complex temporal and spatial pathways, material and symbolic aspects of the past are also transported to new destinations and cultural environments, and Till theorizes this from the perspective of cultural geography. But in this etching, there's no destination visible, no contact zone into which the trees these figures carry could be transplanted. Her figures look forward and backward at the same time. Mita Kupfermink is the daughter of Holocaust survivors from Hungary and Czechoslovakia. She was born and raised in their refuge in Argentina. Her work as a printmaker, a photographer, a video and installation artist is entirely devoted to, although not entirely weighted down by, this history and its vicissitudes. In Kupfermink's iconography of exile, uprooted trees signify removal from home and a violent break in continuity, genealogy, and generation. Absorbing nourishment from the soil, trees contain the knowledge of the past and carry it into the future, but if they're uprooted for too long, they will die, obliterating generations of history and of memory. In the etching, and I have a video that's supposed to be on this slide. Oops. I had another video that didn't transfer onto this computer. It seems to me there's a video version of Ben Camino. It should be right here. Yep, let me see if it's in my USB version. Sorry about that. Pretty strange because, yeah. Ah, okay. How do I get rid of the sound on this? Does somebody know how to turn the sound off this? Oh, here we go. Sorry, I'm a Mac person. So you'll have to watch. Oh no. It's on my screen. I'm playing this and it's not on. I lost my connection. Ah! I couldn't play it off the slideshow, but it's playing here, but it's lost the connection. Ah, okay. But it's not on the, it's not connecting to the play. Can I just play it off the other thing? Oh, okay, here we go. Thank you for saving me.
Just wait till I have to go.
Pardon? Sorry. So what Kupfermink did is animate the etching and create a video version, which I can only, it's an 11-minute animation that I can only play a few minutes of it.
Is that the one I have on here, the wall?
No, it's this one that's on my slideshow.
Okay, super.
That's a different one.
Yes.
Well, now it's not here again. I play it off the other view, slide view?
I don't know where you have it.
Oh, it's right here.
Yeah, no,
But now I've lost it. It's embedded in the slideshow. Sorry.
if it's embedded, it should work. Just send it to the slide. It's the same in that. That's it. That's it.
Well, I can do it when the slideshow is this way, but I don't know why that doesn't connect. So, okay. I don't know why that's keeping me up with this. Coming up right here. Back. Yeah. This is no point. It's right there. So how do I do that? But then when you go up, I lose it. Okay, it's coming. Can we advance it a little bit? I don't want to touch it. Okay, yes. Thank you. Yay! No, I'd like to advance it a little bit. Hmm? But it's not playing now. I just like to advance it a little bit and let it go. I don't. Oh, I see. The screens are reversed. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. It'll come now. Just, it's coming. Would you push it?
No, that would be good. I need to sound up.
No, I don't want sound.
You don't want sound. Okay, sure.
It's here. Victory.
I'll say let's go back to the next slide.
I think that's not going to be a problem.
Hopefully.
That's not going to be a problem.
You 17 stairs again.
It's good for you.
Maybe I
Well, I think this was supposed to be a little more dramatic. Okay. Well, as you can see, this is the animation of the video, and in this animation of El Camino on the way, here humans blend into trees. They themselves become embodied archives of past knowledge that they attempt with difficulty to carry forward. But the animation entails a very different performance of stateless memory, it seems to me, than the etching. It enables the motion of these characters without in any way diminishing the weighty burden of memory that they continue to shoulder. Carrying suitcases, bags, trees, and other objects, these figures walk, they run, they climb, they float, and are blown around on multiple non-intersecting planes, forward, backward, and sideways. They morph into hybrid mythic creatures. They metamorphose into Hebrew letters. They float into and out of books and pages. They walk up and down a ruler. They emerge from coat pockets. Fortunately, you can't see this whole thing. It's 11 minutes, but it's available on Vimeo if you want to watch it later. In the video, Hebrew letters multiply, Torahs walk forwards and back. A king sits in a boat hovering precariously on top of the Tower of Babel. Female figures especially carry heavy suitcases, moving slowly, laboriously across the screen without looking up. Others, liberated, twirl and pirouette in different directions. The cyclical movement and ending of the video implies its repetition, granting it the status of legend or myth. Despite their seemingly unrooted freedom from gravity, these characters seem trapped in the pages and the repeated gestures of an ancient Jewish scenario of expulsion and exile, a story that's written for, about, and against them. And yet, while the etching evokes memory as an overwhelming, paralyzing burden, the video is animated by a kind of surreal humor and incongruity, a playfulness that lightens without diminishing the yoke of the past and its mythic dimensions. As letters float around on the screen, looking like the playful doodles of a child, we're also invited to imagine alternate scenarios with different beginnings and endings. The artist grants her characters the shapes of letters that can be arranged and rearranged, and thus can mobilize multiple potential histories on the threshold of more open-ended futures. These recursive trajectories complicate a genealogical temporality of repeated loss and attempted recovery. This is an evocative aesthetics of small gestures in miniature. Its circuits of mythic memory bypass homogeneous national traditions and heteronormative genealogies in favor of diasporic networks that could potentially be reimagined and reconfigured. But even in this movement, they remain haunted by a specifically Jewish story of disaster, expulsion, and loss that continues to slow and haunt them, and Kupfermans makes sure to include this Jewish symbology. Statelessness as dispossession, and through humor, incongruity, and play, also as a possible opening, all at the same time. Kupfermans' images address both recent and ancient Jewish history and philosophy. She's a student of Kabbalah, a reader of Borges and Hannah Arendt, an artist who experiments with different innovative media. Some of her work draws specifically on women's artisanal practices, such as sewing, fabric, and embroidery, and she uses these to inscribe memory on the very surface of the skin. Let's see if this works out. Yeah. In this work, Bordado en la piel de la memoria, embroidered on the skin of memory, for example, Kupferman embroiders flowers and leaves seemingly right into the lines of her palm. As she does so, she marks her body not so much with memorial representations, but with traditional practices that live on the skin of her hand. But the needle and thread left hanging on the top right fold of the left palm pierce the viewer, it seems to me, provoking a visceral shudder or squirm. As Roberta Culbertson wrote in a classic essay on trauma, it's the break in the skin that most powerfully evokes the wounding that is trauma. The recuperation and transmission of practice, the texture of the thread that sutures and connects, cannot offset the piercing wound of the needle that Kupferman is sure to show us. Carrying these different forms of knowledge, the body, and here especially the hand, become the very sites of memory and its transmission. And yet the simple design of pretty flowers stitched in patterns that many of us learned as young girls is incongruous in relation to that disturbing wound. And I'd like to think that this disjunction between the practice and the design leaves open a visceral space for a more open-ended response, and perhaps also for alternate meanings we might glean from the stitches. The vulnerability communicated in Kupferman's work is a key aspect of what I see as a stateless memory aesthetic. Feminists have defined vulnerability as a space of interconnection in the face of entangled histories such as those of exile, migration, and statelessness. As an embodied species, we share a common vulnerability, emerging from the condition of living in bodies and in time. But importantly, vulnerability is also socially, politically, and economically created and differentially imposed, and it can be mobilized for divergent political aims, as we're seeing so clearly in our current politics. Such a conception of vulnerability, it seems to me, can provide a way to expand discourses of trauma and transmission, circumventing the unforgiving temporality of catastrophe, the sense of inexorable repetition of the past in the present and future, in which injury cannot be healed or repaired, but lives on, shattering worlds in its wake. It could redirect, it seems to me, the retrospective glance of trauma to open alternate temporalities that might be more porous and future-oriented, situated on the threshold of alternate reimagined realities. If we think of vulnerability in this way as an openness toward surprising possibilities, then it might help to engender an ethics and a politics of open-endedness and anticipation. And I think about this in relation to art practices and aesthetic encounters coming from literature and cultural studies. So I'd like to suggest that aesthetic encounters foster this kind of vulnerable receptivity and responsiveness that in Judith Butler's terms become the, and I quote her, become the basis for mobilizing vulnerability rather than engaging its destructive denial. In our acts of reading, looking, and listening, we necessarily allow ourselves to be vulnerable as we practice openness, interconnection, and imagination, as we acknowledge our implication and responsibility. Art, Mike Ball writes in her work on migratory culture, can enact small-scale resistances against the status quo in the social domain. As we saw in En Camino, aesthetic works, whether visual, literary, acoustic, architectural, or theatrical, can enable us to reflect on the vulnerabilities that they elicit within us and the attuned responsiveness that they can provoke. So in my work, I'm trying to assemble a small archive of works that might help to articulate the multidimensional affects of statelessness, connecting them with each other in order to create a possibility of thinking theoretically about stateless memory as a practice of resistance and of possibility. In Kupfermink's stateless aesthetic, the spaces and wounds of expulsion and exile are carried on the body and on the skin. And yet, although her work performs the unforgiving, visceral transfer of a painful past to future generations, it does allow us to glimpse the possibility of alternate futures that we as viewers can help in imagining. In reading Kupfermink's work through a connective lens, I see its resonances with aesthetic practices that have emerged from other diasporic communities, practices that mobilize personal and cultural loss in the service of nonlinear historical trajectories that embrace the suspension of statelessness and that thereby bypass recuperation and return. And in what follows this morning, I'd like to place En Camino in conversation with two other works. The End of Carrying All by Kenyan-American artist Wangechi Mutu, and Reweaving Migrant Inscriptions by the Iraqi-US artist Haif Karaman. All three works turn to ordinary archives to explore the vicissitudes of stateless lives, though statelessness has different valences for each. Their contingent and vulnerable memory work shows how women carry the burden of a painful past and how they transmit it to future generations. Performing memories of forced migration, they help us to think about statelessness as a space, as a form of resistance, refusal, and also I would like to think of possibility, as I've mentioned. But what are the implications of connecting works emerging from such disparate geopolitical spaces? What kind of analysis might enable these connections to remain attentive to particular contexts while also perceiving common histories and strategies beyond and outside of national and state borders? What are the particularities distinguishing forms of statelessness? What are its tropes, its mythologies? What is its iconography? And does it cross borders of difference? It's my hope that a connective reading practice can probe the parameters of solidarity across lines of difference without denying the violence of unbelonging nor evading the political barriers of cross-cultural feminist work that I'm engaging in here. So now I'd like to play the video that you have, which is Wangechi Mutu's The End of Carrying All. So Wangechi Mutu's 3-channel video, it's a 9.5-minute video. Again, we will not be able to see all of it, but perhaps quite a bit of it. Was first exhibited at the 2015 Venice Biennale, and when I saw it, I immediately related it to Mirta Kupfermink's En Camino and that video because it seemed to me that they shared a great deal, and I wrote this to try to figure out what it was. I think it also performs but also re-envisions the past as a burden carried by women. it shares the mythic yet anti-monumental and anti-redemptive quality of En Camino, as well as its attention to small household details that constitute familial and communal lives. While the title En Camino signals the perpetual present of diasporic movement, however, the end of carrying all expresses either a personal desire for closure or an apocalyptic ending to inexorable Sisyphean repetition. Actually, both of these works could be seen as feminist revisions of a Sisyphus myth, read not as an abstract human condition, but as a historically and politically marked and gendered one. Mutu doesn't refer only to Sisyphus, however. The Earth Mother in the work is a kind of Cassandra who cyclically predicts, even as she enacts, impending human and environmental catastrophe. Born in Kenya and working in both Nairobi and New York, Wangechi Mutu is well known for her work in multiple media that explore the structures of gender and power and the effects of colonialism and globalization. The End of Carrying All shows a woman, Mutu herself, slowly swaying forward while balancing a large basket on her head. The landscape evokes an East African savanna, rich in color, though progressively getting darker and more threatening as she moves along. On the soundtrack, which I'm not playing so that you can hear me, we hear the strong wind of the plains and the swarms of birds that ominously fill the unnatural red skies. Actually, could we turn the sound on for just a minute? So you get the sense of this is pretty much it. Okay, thank you. We'll turn that down. Okay, great. She approaches and then passes a tree that becomes more barren as its appearance recurs. As the woman progresses with ever greater difficulty, her basket gets filled with an increasing number of objects. Bicycle wheels, houses, a satellite dish, other electronic and household goods she collects along the way, bending more and more under their weight, occasionally stopping to pick up something or to clear her path. Her migration across the 3 large screens recalls earlier histories of migration across the continent, as well as more recent and current ones that are due to globalized economies, poverty, war, and political upheaval. She's ever more encumbered by the objects of globalization and consumption, whether produced, acquired, recycled, or discarded as waste objects promising a future, even as they participate in destroying its possibility. That basket, well, we're not quite there yet, but it lights up when it gets dark. It contains a whole world, but it's also an impossible burden, impossible to bear. This journey has no national borders to cross, yet it also does not remain in the timeless realm of myth and legend that it evokes. These objects are specific to the entanglements of post-colonial realities. When the weight of the basket becomes excessive for the woman to carry, and you will see this soon, I hope, the earth lights up in an eerie green. It erupts and swallows her and her disproportionate belongings. It gurgles, glows, and heaves as it ingests this unwelcome subject. At this point in the video, we reach the end of carrying all. The huge lump of lava-like matter then rolls down a hill and is slowly absorbed. What erupts here, we wonder? What is being refused, ejected, cleaned up? Mutu compares this planetary apocalypse to a bodily wound, and she writes, "The wound on the skin behaves similarly. Eventually it bursts open, and all that festering stuff comes out, and then it's back to normal. But you know, when things go, when the earth decides to clean up, it's not going to go, oh, you're the good ones and you're all right, you stay, and they go." The female body in this work parallels the space of the earth. Both are injured, both need healing and renewal, a process stalled by the impossible weight that they carry. And then, of course, the journey begins again in a loop that links the violence of the past to new disasters to come. Here, as in El Camino, mobility is slowed by the weight of the past and also by a repetition and cyclicality that seems to leave little room for hope and change. But could we also say that drawing on the knowledge of the past, this work might be using the hiatus of stateless wandering to re-envision the idea of a future, to imagine the possibility of truly starting again or anew. The video performs the refusal and renewal with which Mutu credits the earth. The readiness for such a reading that opens at least that space of possibility that things might begin anew differently, is where the connection to Kupferming's El Camino, it seems to me, is most illuminating, opening Mutu's work to the possibility of less apocalyptic interpretations. Responding to the theme of the 2015 Biennale, All the World's Futures, the work was received as a critique of capitalism and environmental disaster, of the violence done to indigenous landscapes by the consumption and waste resulting from colonization and globalization. These are recognizable themes in Mutu's videos, sculptures, collages, and in the feminist mythologies that she evokes and recreates. I'm just going to let you watch this apocalypse, and then I'm going to show you another sculpture that was exhibited along in front of the video at the Venice Biennale, where a sculpture that illustrates what happens in her work, in her collage work and her sculptures, in which she recycles the materials of global capitalism, such as junk mail and magazine pictures, refashioning these into works of sustainability. So the work that, can I go back to my slides? So this is the work that was exhibited along with the video. She's got the whole world in her. It's fashioned from recycled metal. And this kind of recycling that's very central to her work makes her work a work of critique that all the while also practices salvage and attempted repair, pausing to avert or to delay a catastrophe to come. Let me now turn briefly to my third example, Reweaving Migrant Inscriptions, a recent exhibition now on view in New York by Iraqi-American artist Haif Karaman. And here the female body is again the site of stateless encounters. These encounters are biographical, as the artist represents here, like in other parts of her work, her girlhood refugee exile as an ethnic Kurd from war-torn Iraq, her relocation to Sweden, and then the US. But these echoes, these stateless encounters, are aesthetic as well, as the paintings uneasily combine the artistic traditions of Western Renaissance painting. She spent several years in Italy studying that, of Persian miniatures and Japanese illustrations, to represent a series of nude female figures with the same face, arranged in different expressions. These figures are based on a 3D body scan of the artist herself. There's this, and it seems to me that she lends her own body to carry the weight not just of a personal past of exile and migration, but of a myriad inscriptions, figurations, and projections onto the female body. Inscriptions of colliding artistic traditions, male Eurocentric orientalizing gazes that she both appropriates and refuses. Her mnemonic artifacts, this work, recall Rubens and Botticelli, while at the same time embedding traditional patterns from Persian and Japanese traditions, all crossing in the acts of weaving and reweaving embedded within them. In this particular series, the weavings are based on an object the family brought along in the one suitcase they carried with them from Iraq, the mahafa. As the artist writes, quote, "Our smuggler told us to bring one suitcase and leave everything else behind. The mahafa, a hand-woven fan and an emblematic symbol of Iraq, traveled with us and our falsified passports to Sweden as we became war refugees. Now it decorates our home in the Iraqi corner, mimicking a shrine from a problematic past. In some of the paintings, the women carry mahafas like flags, sometimes upside down, but in others, the figures' bodies take the shape of the woven fan. At times, strands made out of palm fronds are interwoven with the strips of linen of the canvas. After painting the figures on pale linen thinly covered in oil paint, the artist sent the works out to be cut into strips, and then she rewove these back into the canvas. Some images remain frayed, with the weaving spilling out of the picture's frame, while in others, rewoven sections are embedded into the original design, painful visceral reminders of bodily and material injuries that can be mended if not healed. The visceral cut into the surface of the canvas is the sign not only of bodily wounding, but also of the psychic trauma of statelessness, both on an individual and communal scale. The free-floating bodies themselves gesture toward the suspension of statelessness in its multiple dimensions, its backward and forward orientation, its creation of spaces of encounter. Two small works, woven out of the strands of painted linen, depict the artist's open mouth with bright red lips, showing both the cry of pain, perhaps, and the effort to articulate it in a Munchian scream. In both works, the mouth is framed by a paper grid. I don't know if you can see that here, probably not perfectly. And so the grid, of course, recalls the grids of transnational modernism used by artists like Agnes Martin, and thus she gestures toward a tradition that she embraces, even as it entraps her in the small square in the center of the large grid. At the same time, however, this disembodied cry brings with it other sounds in a series of works especially sensitive to sound memory. These works recall an earlier series, the 2016 Audible Inaudible, and in those paintings contained a layer of sonic foam. Some of the So the canvases were built to absorb and disguise the sound memories that these bodies carry, sounds of war, of air raid sirens that dominated the artist's childhood, creating invisible if deep visceral wounds. Their resulting dimensionality and thickness suggests an additional layer of meaning that remained resonant, if impenetrable. The paintings in the present series contain additional cryptic inscriptions that you can see here on the top. See the little red mark on the top right? You can see them in every one of the paintings. And they're very hard to figure out. But strangely, they're seal-like marks that it turns out are made by using plastic model stencils of figures of American soldiers from play sets, right? Stencils that mark Karaman's canvases and their skin-like surfaces with the inscription of war and violence, but war and violence as boys play. The figures themselves remain opaque to us, even if they mostly face us directly. Their expressions are unengaged, unreachable, conventional. This is different from the colonial subject's practice of returning the look, however resistedly. It's a refusal to respond, a refusal that Walter Mignolo, writing about her work, describes as a form of visual disobedience that engenders a decolonial aesthetic. Karaman's painted woman emerges and multiplies in the space of the stateless encounter between migrant lives and colliding artistic traditions. She's the product of intersecting gazes and traumatic memories of displacement, palpable in the torn, cut up, disfigured and imperfectly repaired surfaces of the paintings. The artist writes about this figure, and I quote, "Her body is a site where trauma resides, and in that violence there is rebirth." Perhaps this comes with the territory of being a refugee, an endless activity of collecting fragments and repetitively weaving them into our memories, both as a form of mourning trauma, but also as a drive to circumvent erasure. In this painting, strip 1, the face and body disappear altogether. We just have the strips of canvas uneasily reassembled and framed. The breaks cannot be disguised, the wounds cannot be healed, and yet the viewer realizes that the strips could actually be rearranged in new and different formations. The scripts could be rewritten and reimagined. Like the female figures in Kupfermeng and Mutu's work, Karaman's figures collect the fragments of migrant lives and weave them into stories that announce at least the possibility of rebirth and new beginnings, even as they powerfully recall the violence of the past and as they resist amnesia. The small gestures of intervention performed by these three artists enable us, it seems to me, to try to define the suspended space-time of the stateless encounter. Despite their differences, there's a great deal that they share if we bring them together as I've done this morning. Together, it seems to me, they suggest several ways in which we can contest the monumentality of nationalist imaginaries. They share a bold strategy of appropriating the colonizing and commodifying stereotypes that disempower them. They share the use of animation and performance. Karaman also has a performance that, in which she animates the figures in her paintings that she stages in the galleries. So they share animation and performance. They embrace incongruity and contradiction, as well as fantasy and play. These strategies and others enable them to confront and reimagine painful pasts and also ominous futures. If we allow ourselves to be vulnerable to their provocation, they can join us too to envision alternative histories and to imagine other possible temporalities. Thank you. I'm okay. I've got this. Yeah.
Okay, so now it's time for questions, comments, discussion.
Apparently we need a mic, right?
Yeah, thank you first of all for that very inspiring talk. I really enjoy every time when you use art to develop your own biography and your very theoretical thoughts also. I was wondering in what sense you would distinguish then migrant memories from stateless memories, and especially for the first two works of art, it was sometimes hard for me to see the statelessness. And I was thinking about the way, for instance, Willem Flusser theorizes migrancy in über die Freiheit des Migranten or on the freedom of the migrant. So I thought somehow that the idea of migrant memory would somehow connect these works, maybe in a more visible way than the idea of statelessness, though I really like the dialectic of the narrowness and the potential.
Yeah, and you know, this is something I'm still thinking about and really trying to define, and I've been reading a great deal about migrant memory, not about stateless memory because I haven't encountered it really, and so I guess what I was trying to define is, with the stateless, is a moment, a pause, a hiatus. Migrancy, it seems to me, is always on the move, and on the move towards something, right? And I thought that the stateless could give us that in-between space-time that's just a pause, and that's what I was looking for, a space of possible encounters. So I was thinking about the contact zone, but that's already a kind of destination, right, where things connect and intersect. So it was in that sort of floating these works and allowing them to relate to each other outside of the time-space of specific, not specific tradition, but specific nation states, right? That's what I was actually trying to define. So, maybe Yarula, we could talk later, and you can help me figure out how to be more precise in distinguishing these things. But the migrant, it seems to me, yes, they do show us migrancy, of course, and the iconography is one of exile and migration, right? But where is that pause and moment where things could go in many different directions at the same time, and that also has that kind of legendary or almost mythic dimension that I see in all of these works. They create a kind of iconology for migration that is in some ways still, but dynamic and still at the same time. So that's what I'm trying to look to define, but I agree with you, I haven't quite done it yet. And I knew you would ask me something like that, because you're very methodical.
Good morning. My name is Guy Weiner. I was very much inspired by your talk, of course, but I wanted to ask a bit of a provocative question, as I'm aware that there's also some sociologists and anthropologists in the room, among others. And the question is, whose memory? You've shown us three remarkable artists and their artwork, and you've given us very inspirational and incisive readings of how this work can be done. But I'm wondering about the move between representations and remembrance. How do we bring back into this analysis and into this work the actual stateless people relating to this beyond the interpretation of the critic and the artist, and where do we see this kind of popular engagement with the phenomenon that you observe and these works which you're presenting as alternative iconography?
Well, this question goes to the heart of what I think is happening in memory studies and at this conference, which is that we're talking across differences of this disciplinary training and differences in methodologies. And I think we each approach this question of memory from our own disciplinary location. So, and I'm finding it difficult to cross those boundaries, and I think we kind of aspire to an interdisciplinarity, but I think we think of it as a transdisciplinarity rather than an interdisciplinarity. So it would be wonderful to try to sit down and talk about that, because I think the reason I turn to artworks is that they give us a way of thinking and imagining in the conditions of our very own lives in a really economical way, right? In an encapsulated icon that enables us to understand something that's going on in our own lives and in our communities and for larger population groups, also individuals, families, and larger population groups. How we connect to them, why do certain artworks like this actually really speak to us? Because we recognize ourselves in them. But I don't think we could then take that insight and go back to those populations and measure sociologically how they experience statelessness. So I started with my own experience because I think I like to theorize from the biographical, hopefully not to be self-indulgent, but to try to measure how the textures of people's lives, and then I find that some of the artworks that I turn to speak back to that, and that I find myself somehow reflected in them. And I think that's why we go to art and literature, music, film, dance, and so on. But I mean, that's sort of the best I can do. I think it would take smaller interdisciplinary discussion to see how we could learn from each other and whether this kind of analogy actually holds. But I would venture, first of all, that these artists' biographical experience has informed their work. The experiences that they recognize in their communities, they've tried to represent and encapsulate those in their work. But there's even more going on in work that really speaks to larger populations and that we return to, which is that they carry those kinds of reflections across time. And I would venture that some of these can do that. But they require a close reading to speak to us that way.
Thank you for that great talk. I just was going to make a very quick point about that possibility of a link between art and sociology, and then ask my actual question.
Can you stand up? I can't see you. Okay.
I wonder if reception studies might be a way to approach, one of the ways to approach a connection between sociology and art, because it's a way of engaging with spectators and their reaction to to the art, whether it be film, literature, etc. Thank you for that wonderful talk. I just wonder very, very quick, my actual question is about alternative timelines or alternative temporalities, because I thought that was very evocative when you spoke about that, and it made me think about something which is a representation of statelessness but not migration, would be the enforced removal of a sense of belonging from an indigenous peoples, as in Guzman's film The Pearl Button, where you get this wonderful image of people from Tierra del Fuego who still are allowed to paddle their canoes on a planet out there somewhere in an alternative universe. And it just sort of made me think about what you said about alternative possibilities in some of these artworks. So I just wondered if you had a comment on that, or anything else about this idea of alternatives out there, which are in a way of kind of moving beyond statelessness and actually proposing something alternative, another possibility. Thank you.
Well, I mean, Guzman's work is so resonant because he's always working in so many different time zones, right? The time of the present, the time of the recent past, of the time of the more distant past, and then planetary time. And he always tries to somehow overlay those onto each other, which makes the kind of linear temporality that we're used to living in, and that memory studies actually embraces by talking about relation of the present to the past, to the present, and the future in pretty linear ways, even though we always say that, you know, memory is from the present to the past, and it's the present that creates the past, and so on. But I think we're sort of stuck in a particular way of conceiving of time. And if anybody can lift us out of that, I think it's Guzman, not just in The Pearl Button, but in, what's the other one? Nostalgia for the Light, which is such a wonderful film. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Estelle Rasch. I would like to thank you for a very inspiring and rich talk. And I'd like to go back to some of the language that you used. You talked about this in-between, a hiatus and a pause. And that made me think that all of those imply that there is something on the other side, that statelessness is an in-between period that you can then use for all sorts of dynamic purposes. But what if statelessness has no end? What if it is not a pause between one state and the other? Maybe it is... So some of the dynamics that you're discussing come from looking back at a time of statelessness from the privileged position of having a state. So I was wondering whether you thought about those issues.
You're right on. I mean, it's a privileged position that I'm using to talk about statelessness. But I guess, and it's an in-between time for everybody in the sense that there's an aspiration for citizenship and belonging in every stateless person. I would say that, you'd be insane not to want that in the present world, right? So in that sense, it's always an in-between that anticipates an end to it. But it's also, it seems to me, a space of possibility of reimagining those relationships where the belonging to a state and citizenship papers are the only way to have a personhood and a life that's encapsulated in a tradition and in a story and in a national story and so on. So what if we try to enlarge that hiatus? I think we would find some unbearable aspects to it that I also tried to evoke, and that I think these artworks really do evoke, right? But also, it seems to me that then the possibility of rethinking everything, like the apocalyptic ending of the Wangechi Mutu thing, where I think, even though it starts again, there's that moment where she invites us to rethink the whole thing, right? And just to start over. So that's the kind of space that I try to evoke. But you're absolutely right that one would not wish that in our present world, the condition of statelessness on anybody for more than a second, right? Yes, Carol.
With the microphone at the table.
Excuse me?
The microphone.
Can you hear me? There's another microphone. Is that right?
Excuse me. Thank you. That was absolutely stupendous and very moving. The question I have is, in these works, I felt that the word stateless didn't really apply to them,
Okay.
that maybe it was homeless or some other kind of lossless or something lost, because I didn't feel that they were aspiring to citizenship, that they were looking for to be in another state. And so it's that nation-state container that I understand completely in your story, but I didn't see it in theirs.
Mm-hmm.
I thought they were aspiring to, if you want to talk about the in-betweenness, to something else, but they were also burdened by the loss, and I wasn't sure that it was the loss of the state or of citizenship. So I'd like to hear you say it, if there were another term for stateless to describe this unbearableness of loss and still possibility, that I thought you were completely beautifully evoked, but I just didn't feel that the citizenship was the loss or the destination.
So, yeah, I've been thinking about this, so I welcome your comments and also suggestions of how to conceptualize this. When I think of them, of course, biographically as well, right? I don't think it's just like homeless moving from one place, from one home to another within a country or anything like that. Yes, they're carrying these burdens, and the move across an African continent where nation states are artificially created, and through colonial conquest and so on. That what happens in Hutu is like she's really beyond that, above that, outside of that, right? But it isn't just, I don't want to just say homeless because that carries the notion of nostalgia and, home is this other idea. I do think that these works involve carrying your belongings with you, carrying your uprooted trees, taking trees along. Really is more than just a homelessness, like if you were moving from New York to Florida, right? You would not bring your tree. So I think there's more to it than that, and in our present condition, thinking about refugees, which I think these works actually respond to, I think we need a term that politicizes this condition. And I really hadn't thought of it at all as statelessness until the DACA issue happened a couple of months ago, and I flashed back to that moment and to that word. And so it's really very autobiographical for me to call it that, but then when I really tried to, very much identifying with these young people in the US who are about to be deported to someplace they've never been to, that was a term that emerged for me. But I agree with you that there's much more going on here than citizenship in one particular state. But maybe it's also reimagining what citizenship might be like that isn't bounded in that particular way and that doesn't require that moment of fear at a border that you're not allowed to cross, right? So I think they're trying to reimagine that condition.
Hi, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. And I have, what I was thinking when I saw your title, I thought you were going to talk about something else. Mainly, I didn't think about stateless because the term that is used in Spanish for the situation that you describe, autobiographical, is apátrida, which is apátrida, which is really not having a homeland, which is something that you couldn't say about Kopernik's work, because the insistence on the Hebrew letters and really points to the idea of having a home and not having a state. So, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, and also I think that apatria, for example, in Argentina, it was used in the 19th century to describe indigenous people. So there's this idea that you sort of said the idea of home against the idea of state. And then the other thing that is related to this is that the discussion on refugees at this point in history and at the point you're describing in the 40s is clearly focused on the idea of the state as the body that can guarantee certain rights. And I wonder if there's a way we can move beyond that to think of an accountability that goes beyond the state. Because clearly, the situation today is that states are not guaranteeing rights. So,
yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, both of those comments. So yes, I think the urge here is to move beyond the state in our imaginative, in our horizon of imagination, right? And to try to think of other ways of belonging specifically. I think the idea of apatia is really interesting. I would not, I think for Kupferming it's very interesting because the Hebrew letters don't mean that you have apatia. It's really, the patria is then the language, right? It's not a homeland, it's not a return to a homeland that she's actually looking for. None of these works are actually about return or recuperation. They're not recuperative in that sense, and that's why I didn't want to call it homeless, because that involves, the idea of like returning to a home. And I think there's nothing here about return. But the apatria is sort of the absence of a place that you, think of patria as something that you're identifying with, right? Which is very different from state. It is a kind of homeland identification, and losing that, to me, feels like statelessness. So, when I was raised under communism in Romania, patriotism was like the thing that was drilled into us, right? And so that's where the patria comes in. So the patria is really the thing that's imposed on you from the outside, so that it becomes like an entire, your identity is completely merged with that of the state, not because ignoring cultural, national, religious differences in different population groups, it tries to absorb everybody in that idea of the patria. So I think of that as a kind of formation of a kind of political formation more than something that is organically somehow connected to a sense of individual or belonging. So it doesn't strike me as so different a term from stateless, but maybe I need to kind of look up some of the etymologies and study that, but thank you.
Yeah, Marianne, I really like actually the notion of statelessness. The only thing I wondered, it seems at this point that you have statelessness set up in a binary with citizenship, or at least in the way you started out. But I was thinking if you can't also use statelessness for people who are technically speaking citizens, but are nevertheless clearly disenfranchised by the state. Because one of the things I'm thinking, the most obvious example would be, if you're going off of your example, again, of European Jews who remain citizens, so we're not talking about German or Austrian Jews, but clearly were disenfranchised within their own states because they experienced persecution by the Nazis within those states. So they were never officially stateless. Belgian Jews, Dutch Jews, French Jews, but of course were subjected to this same state of disenfranchisement. But I'm also thinking whether it isn't actually a really useful way to think about the state of African Americans in the United States, where we're thinking about people who were never citizens, they were experienced a forced migration to this country as slaves. And I actually find your term incredibly helpful to start thinking about their position and also their continued disenfranchising today. All I wanted to point out is that it actually resonates to me in all these other ways that you're maybe not mentioning that I think are actually very helpful. And then you can also, of course, think about the statelessness, technically having a state, but the statelessness of Palestinians and so forth, and all of these. So instead of actually saying maybe it's not the right term, I think I find it a very helpful term. So I want to thank you for that, and I'm thinking of all these other ways that it can resonate. So this is more a comment, and I don't know if you have.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very helpful because, of course, there are, even within nominal citizenship, there are tremendous variations of how citizenship is experienced and also imposed. When we talk about second-class citizenship, there are ways of actually speaking about those gradations. But I think what we have in some of the works that I showed is also this idea of perpetual migration, right? So I think that's probably a little bit different, you know, I think the kinds of conditions that you've outlined, which are so helpful, do not have that migrant aspect to it. So I would have to think about how to connect those thoughts. But thank you.
Roman Dubasevich, I like your talk very much. It moved me at several moments, and I think it has a very political point in one sense. If you look from the Western academia, from the people who have a state, who never felt how it feels to have a state or coming from a failed state, it can seem that you don't leave a national frame of reference. But I don't think it's your point, because the feeling of having no state, it's such a fundamental one, it's a very visceral one. And the advantage of your presentation is, in my view, exactly this exploring of this border between, or of this interconnection between, on the one hand, being rooted in these political realities, in these sociological realities, visceral realities, and on the other hand, trying to find a way of emancipation from them, this moment of emancipation perhaps through the art. And in these terms, it brought, in my eyes, these two realities together. Perhaps the reality of the people who would not be ever able to understand this kind of art, to express themselves, to represent the feelings of normal migrants, displaced persons, yes, on the one hand. But on the other hand, privileged publics like we, who are able to perhaps develop instruments to move beyond the state, beyond this frame of reference. And I think in this manifold functional possibility you talk presented to me, because as a Ukrainian citizen, every time I cross the border of Ukraine, I wait at the border of Ukraine and Poland. And a couple of years ago, the border from Poland to Germany, I felt this feeling, the same feeling in my stomach, to move beyond this, from one reality to the other. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you so much for this comment, which actually clarifies a lot for me, because I think that one thing I learned moving at the age that I did and in the way that I did, and in the way that I grew up with this kind of imposed belonging, sense of belonging that I didn't actually feel and my family taught me not to feel, is that you're always, that sense of citizenship and belonging is never complete, and if it is, then you're really in trouble, right? There's always some distance, there's always some ways in which we are and aren't. What if we really try to focus on that space of distance and try to make something out of that? And I think that's really what the provocation here that I find in these works. Let's enlarge that gap between, being Ukrainian or American or whatever we are, and checking off that box when they ask for your citizenship. You check off a box, but that doesn't mean that box encapsulates you. So it's really trying to enlarge the horizons of our imagination beyond that kind of way of thinking of organizing populations and everything that it involves, which is, I think, a way of looking at the past, a way of looking at the past relation to the present, of looking at time and space and territory, and how territory and temporality kind of intersect. And I think that's, memory studies can actually help us do that. I think it's one of the real potentials of this field, is to enable us to reimagine those relationships. And I think the vulnerabilities of nationhood and statehood we can see in the way that these insecurities are acted out. every day on our television screens. I mean, why do American presidents have to keep telling us that it's the greatest country in the world? I mean, why do we have to reiterate that all the time? Well, because, well, we know it isn't, and because of how fragile everybody's belonging in that sense is. So how can we enact a refusal of those identifications and enlarge the gap that I think we probably all feel when we take out our passport and our relationship to that passport. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you very much.
We can also enlarge the discussion beyond the paper to some of the more general topics that came out yesterday, which I think were so resonant. Hi.
Thank you very much for your presentation. While you were talking, I was trying to think about times when probably I have been stateless, and I'm thinking about my stateless memories. I'm walking on the Indian Ocean as a memory space at the moment, and I have to fly across many places. And I was just thinking about when stuff happens in the plane, in the aeroplane, and I'm thinking at one point just flying across the world and trying to imagine where did I have an almost plane crash, where do I remember talking to somebody about a certain topic and so on, and the idea that then I do not know about the geography in that sense of where the plane was and so on. And when something really crazy happens is when then I would actually go to the touch screen and try to find out where did I meet this, probably you have an interesting person you're talking to about something, or something happens and I have to locate myself. It's just a thought of thinking about when you were speaking about all the other possibilities.
Thank you. I mean, it's those extraterritorial spaces like airplanes, but even airports or, right, that seem to be, having that sense of resonance and possibility, and perhaps, academic conferences that bring us together in a located space, but then, this auditorium could actually be almost anywhere. We're all speaking English, strangely, even though we're coming from so many different places, so we're creating this, really quite artificial sense of community in a language that, for many of us, is not necessarily the language that we write in or speak in, so we have different relationships to it. So we could think of the academic conference as also a kind of extraterritorial floating space that we locate on our GPS, but, that could be elsewhere.
Hi, I really wanted to thank you for your attention to the body in your presentation, both in the opening part where you paid attention to your own bodily experiences, and in your attention to the bodies in the art you were looking at. And in light of the conversation that we've been having, and particularly the last two speakers, I was thinking about the ways that and actually I was reflecting on the session that we were in yesterday as well, with the dance performance and the way that we were brought bodily into that. Made me think about the ways that there are all these different types of statelessness, and actually it's our visceral reaction to them enables us to make connections across these different types of statelessness and these in-between spaces. So perhaps the type of statelessness that you experienced may have been technically a slightly different type of statelessness than the ones being depicted in the art, and yet we're able to make these sorts of visceral connections between them in the same way as we were able to make some connections with the dancer yesterday. And perhaps it's in those bodily connections that it opens up these spaces of possibility. So I don't know if there's a question in there somewhere, but I wondered if you might comment on that.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things I like thinking about is a really bodily, visceral connection to these artworks, right, which we don't necessarily learn to monitor. So thank you for that comment, and it's helpful to think about it in that way.
Excuse me. Hello, I'll stand up because I'm right.
Hey, there are 2 mics, so I think.
There are 2 mics. There's an etiquette here. I don't know whether I've got it yet. A couple of people have said things like John down at the front there about being kind of in between countries and not quite knowing where you are. And I was thinking about that. My wife is researching modern slavery and fishing fleets, and there's a out on the open ocean. You've got people that work on fishing boats. It's actually happening with British fishing boats. It was in the news recently. There's a sense there of not knowing where you are if you're a stateless person. The people on those boats, and there are other types, it's referred to as modern slavery. The power comes in as well, because when I think about the stateless people, maybe like yourself, that you were talking about, there's a lack of agency maybe in that. But if you go for the definition of power as one person's power over another in a more intentional sense, people in situations like that are often intentionally kept stateless. They might have false papers and they live sometimes for years on boats, and obviously there are the people in other situations. So yeah, I'm just kind of thinking about expanding what it is to be stateless, and that there are obviously many dimensions, as people have mentioned. Again, that's not really a question, but it's just me kind of thinking and expanding.
Thank you. I mean, that's great, and you know, so deep, we are so deeply implicated in this. I mean, I don't know if anybody here is from NYU, or if people are formerly from NYU. I mean, the campuses that they're building in Abu Dhabi, the workers have their passports taken away while they're working on those, on those campuses, and building the campuses that that are our universities, and live in trailers in 100-degree heat and so on. So yeah, we're deeply implicated in those structures.
Hi, I found your presentation very moving, and it eventually led me to a place of thinking about my dilemma, which is that I've never been stateless. I was born in the United States, I'm a US citizen, I live in the United States, and I feel like I'm a prisoner of my state, which has been intensified by a very long-term connection with traditional folk music. And I was thinking of the example of a particular folk group in England which prohibited people from singing any song which did not come out of their own tradition. I sing traditional songs that are from Scotland, from various parts of England, from Appalachia, and I realized that coming from New York, there was no tradition that I could sing out of. And this is a metaphor for the fact that in many ways I feel like I come out of no tradition. I don't feel like I have a home, and I can't escape. And I could never immigrate to another place. I'm too old. I would not be considered valuable. It's just it's a paradox.
Well, New York is its own island, right? So.
Thank you very much for the talk.
Hi.
Hi. And the way I heard it, you were speaking about stateless memory as gendered and embodied labor. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on how it is gendered, because it was very feminized, the images that you brought of it and the artworks. And then the other very tiny question, I think, is I was thinking about how memory both is something we carry, but also something that carries us. And you mentioned gravity, also a bit like the structure of our bones that weighs something, but also enables us to move. And then you had this beautiful triptych by Martha Kupfermink with these trees. And I was thinking of the trees as things that some of us have left behind as we migrate, but also about our family histories. And I was wondering whether this potentiality that I thought you highlighted beautifully of stateless memory, of a weight, but that also constitutes our very being in the world, whether that was unique to stateless memory, or whether that is something that you in general see as something that pertains to memory. Thank you.
Well, I couldn't have said it more beautifully and poetically than you did, so I don't think that's a question that I can answer. I mean, but I hope it's something we can continue to think about, and as we think about the qualities of memory. I mean, I have tried to theorize this from my work at, in feminist studies, and I think there's a, it's not really necessarily gendered, but I think it's a feminist work. I think that I look particularly at works by women and who really work, who try to define a gendered kind of aesthetic. And with the artisanal practices, I mean, you notice I also showed you the Silvina de Marianne embroideries, so I'm interested in those kinds of stories and the figurations of the burdens of memory carried by women thematically, but from a more sort of feminist theoretical perspective. I think it's the connections that I tried to make that I think we're kind of taught right now not to try to make these connections across different cultures because of the specificities. And it seemed to me that this idea of migration and statelessness gave me the possibility to bring together works that emerge from very, very different traditions. And it's a kind of wager that I made to try to do that in a spirit of solidarity that I think comes out of feminism, but it also, feminism has always been very, rightly so, very suspicious and suspicious of. So I thought that maybe in this idea of the stateless, these artists could meet, because I found these resonances among them, and I've also shown them each other's work to show, I've worked with them and talked to them to try to see whether they would accept that kind of analogy or reject it. And so far they have, these particular artists have accepted it. But I'm trying to gather a small canon of works that are not necessarily very well known, but that enable me to think about these things from, decades of feminist work from that perspective. So thank you.
Hi, thank you for a very evocative talk. I was wondering if there's a deliberate kind of thinking about statelessness in terms of something having no physical presence at all as well, and whether that can add maybe something extra to kind of some additional layers to what you're thinking about. So this kind of idea of having no presence in the world also kind of seems to maybe be made more powerful by the idea of just that the very physicality of something having no state as being not physically there.
Tell me what you mean by not being physically there.
So kind of the idea of, if we're talking about something as having state or form in a physical sense, saying like if for something to be stateless, there is no presence, it has no form. And whether that's something that could play into this idea.
Yeah, and of course, what is a state? It's a totally artificial, it's an idea, right? But it's an idea that becomes mapped onto territory and then acquires a grounding, but it's really a completely artificial, formation. So I think, that's very helpful way to think about it.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. It was absolutely brilliant. I just wanted to follow up on the kind of the feminist question, which I thought was absolutely crucial to your thinking about memory and to those practices. I wonder whether you would go as far as to say that the condition of femininity is that of statelessness. I mean, women don't have states. States are not places for women. So they have to make states for themselves. You talked about a lot of disobedience, like visual disobedience, and lots of things that women do in order to make states for themselves. And I wondered if it's at the core of your thinking, if it's what you're looking for in female artists' works rather than male. And also, if you already looked at the transmission of this kind of experience, so female statelessness as something that's being transferred, and in what kind of aesthetics then it finds its expression.
Well, I think, I'm hesitant to generalize and essentialize femininity. So, a while ago I would have gladly embraced that idea, but I think I'm just a lot more hesitant to do that. So I prefer to think about the very specific conditions, which you're right, and I think when Kupferming shows us the women carrying those suitcases, I think she's trying, they're not the men carrying the suitcases, they're carrying a tortoise, right? And so I think that is significant. The fact that Wangechi Mutu's figure is a woman is significant, symbolically, but also realistically. But I don't know if, I wouldn't create a gender difference like that. I think that certainly in present political conditions, there are really, among migrant populations, gender differences are really important to think about. I think the transmission is very much that. I think that as children of migrants, immigrants, migrants, and refugees do inherit some of those visceral qualities that I tried to describe, and I think probably a lot of us in this room are products of that, of that condition that defines the 20th century that we talked about yesterday, right? And we're all, many of us are probably children of that, and I think we do inherit that kind of sense of home as something that's of home and of belonging that's very fragile and that we know could be taken away from us almost at any time. So I think that's very much transmitted. And in the artworks that I showed you, I think the basket and the suitcases, they carry that with them too. That's part of the baggage that's being carried across generations. What we then do with that, I think what Wangechi Mutu shows us is it's just gonna swallow us up, and it's gonna erupt. And then, because it's more than that, it has to do not just with our families or our communities, but it has to do with what we're doing to the planet, right? And so I think that there's much more going on here about the kind of memory of the planet that I think they're trying to express as well. So it's going on many levels.
Okay, thank you very much, Marianne.
Thank you, Annie.
Thank you to all of you.
Thank you all. This was so helpful.